Reality TV often blurs the line between entertainment and the real world, sometimes with chilling consequences. These are the most disturbing crimes that happen live on reality TV. Cheaters is a reality TV show built on confrontation. Each episode promises explosive revelations, emotional breakdowns, and sometimes violence. Hosted by Joey Greco, the show thrives on exposing infidelity and capturing raw, unpredictable reactions. In the mid-2000s, during one particularly tense episode, the conflict crossed a dangerous line, one that shook the viewer's very foundation and raised serious questions about the price of reality TV drama. It begins with a pregnant 21-year-old woman named Renee Trudgett, who was weighed down by growing suspicion after boyfriend Mitchell Goldstein started staying out late, insisting he was working overtime to support their future. But the extra financial support Mitchell promised never materialized, and his explanations felt increasingly empty. Their relationship grew strained, especially after Renee discovered she was pregnant, and Mitchell urging her to end it, insisting they weren't ready to raise it. But Renee refused, and that single divide deepened into resentment, and their arguments became more volatile with each passing week. And as the tension mounted, Renee found herself increasingly isolated, and so desperate for answers, Renee turned to cheaters for help. For 12 days, Cheaters investigators closely monitored Mitchell's movements. The first 2 days were uneventful, but on day 3, they finally caught sight of him leaving his home, and the team observed him speaking on his cell phone as they followed at a safe distance to not draw any attention. And then Mitchell made an unexpected stop at an unknown address. Within minutes, a woman appeared, later identified as Cassandra Terrazas. Mitchell opened the passenger door for her, and together they drove to a nearby restaurant, and the two of them walked hand in hand into the establishment, really more than friends. Investigators kept their focus, aware that the case was heating up. Mitchell would then completely disappear from home for the next couple of days. That was until day 7, when he was seen again at Cassandra's home, and the two again left together, heading out for the evening. The cameras tracked them to a local sports bar, where they spent the evening together before leaving side by side. By day 12, Cheaters had pinpointed Mitchell's whereabouts once more. He'd returned to Cassandra's house, where they spent uninterrupted time together before leaving for a ride. And throughout the whole investigation, recorded phone calls revealed Mitchell's deceptive behavior, as it appears he was playing games with both women involved. With the evidence mounting, Cheaters prepared to end the charade and confront Mitchell, bringing the truth directly to Renee. The confrontation was set to take place on a boat, anchored on a quiet lake. Joey Greco and the crew navigated the waters, closing in on Mitchell and Cassandra. And when the confrontation unfolded, Mitchell actually denied any wrongdoing, insisting that Cassandra was his girl and that she makes me happy, just for right now. However, Cassandra was also confronted and asked if she knew Mitchell had a girlfriend, and she claimed she didn't. And despite his denials, Renee had video evidence, a clear, undeniable proof of Mitchell's secret relationship. And of course, the tension continued to escalate. Mitchell refused to accept responsibility for Renee or their unborn child, and his defensiveness and anger grew volatile as he repeatedly demanded that everyone get off his boat. And suddenly, Mitchell pulled out a knife and decided to stab Joey Greco, the host of the show, who'd stepped in during the heated confrontation. Crew members quickly sprang into action, rushing to restrain Mitchell and rescue Joey, who sustained a 3-inch stab wound to his lower left abdomen. And once they managed to get Mitchell under control, the crew immediately called for emergency assistance, and paramedics fortunately arrived to the scene rather quickly, administering first aid to Joey before rushing him to a nearby hospital. His injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, and he was stabilized after emergency treatment. This violent episode sparked intense debate about the ethics and safety of reality TV. Mitchell Goldstein was arrested and charged, brought to Rowlett police station, and spending time behind bars for his role in the stabbing. For Renee and Joey, the ordeal left lasting scars. But while many viewers were relieved the host survived, others sensed something was off. A nagging suspicion that the episode wasn't what it seemed. And that doubt caught the attention of Matt Meager, the chief investigative correspondent for the famous news magazine program Inside Edition, who launched a deep dive into the incident. He reached out directly to one of the women involved in the episode, securing an interview that would become the first time she publicly revealed the truth about what really happened.
So none of it was true?
Matt asked Cassandra Terrazas.
No,
she replied. Cassandra, who turned out to be a Dallas hotel receptionist, revealed she was simply paid $350 to play the role of a woman caught in an affair, and the entire situation was actually staged at a Dallas lake, where boats were rented to create the illusion of an unexpected confrontation. But while the episode shows the police arresting Mitchell after Joey was attacked, authorities in Texas later confirmed that no arrests were made for such a crime during that period. And Cassandra even admitted that the ambulance was rented and that the blood was fake, and even the moment of someone falling off the boat was planned.
You're positive he wasn't stabbed? Absolutely, he wasn't harmed at all.
Matt then took the story further, questioning Joey Greco and Bobby Goldstein, an executive producer for the show. And while Joey declined to confirm any key details, Bobby maintained that the episode was 100% real. And so this episode kind of blurred truth and fiction with stage drama. But this next show truly showed something far more personal and brutal.
Across just 7 short years, her life would fall apart in real time.
Tanya Kooley first appeared on television in 2002 as a cast member of The Real World Chicago, and by 2009 she was a regular competitor on the Challenge franchise, known for her parties she threw and her openness about her struggle with substance abuse. But while filming in Phuket, Thailand, Tanya had an experience that completely changed the trajectory of her life. But it wasn't until nearly 4 years later, actually, in October of 2011, that the full story came to light with the filing of a lawsuit. By then, most viewers had already forgotten the season of Challenge, but Tanya hadn't. According to her complaint, what happened in that house wasn't just reality show chaos. It was something far more unsettling. She described an environment where alcohol flowed endlessly, not as courtesy but as a tactic. Cast members drank because producers encouraged it, and so nights blurred into early mornings. And since arguments and hookups made good television, the cameras of course never stopped rolling either. Tanya said that on one of those nights, after hours of drinking, she suddenly blacked out, completely unconscious and unaware of what was happening around her. And while she was on the floor, two male cast members, Kenneth Santucci and Evan Starkman, took another contestant's toothbrush, and the item was used to invade her, rubbing the toothbrush against certain parts, and even went further. She wasn't awake at the moment, which meant she couldn't consent, but what she described happened next was even more disturbing. Tanya claimed that the unwanted physical contact was so severe that she woke up the following morning with pain and visible lacerations in her areas. She also claimed that production was not only aware of what happened, but they actually intervened in the worst way possible by simply quietly removing the toothbrush and replacing it with a new one to eliminate evidence, to keep the show running smoothly. For days, she didn't actually know what happened while she was unconscious, so she continued filming and interacting with the same cast members, joking on camera and following orders from production. It wasn't until another female cast member pulled her aside and told her the truth. From that moment on, Tanya said she felt betrayed, not only by the people she lived with, but by the entire machine behind the show. The environment she trusted had become something, and the blurred chaos of reality TV had now crossed into criminal territory. But her lawsuit wasn't actually just about what happened that night. It was about the entire culture that allowed it, the silence and the alcohol, and the producers who allegedly protected the show at the expense of a cast member's safety. And for Tanya, this was only the beginning of a long and painful attempt to reclaim what was taken from her. In her complaint, Tanya accused the production company Bunham/Murray Productions and parent company MTV Viacom of intimate violation, negligence, and wrongful termination. She argued that female contestants on the show were regularly stripped of their swimsuits, and male cast members were encouraged to touch women in intimate areas. The producers, however, rejected the claims, stating that Tanya's statements were completely baseless, and they basically just told Tanya to just deal with it when it was brought to their attention during the show. Over the next year, both sides disputed the fine details. Tanya's legal papers detailed the harsh conditions for alcohol consumption, long nights, and intoxication, and the absence of protective oversight. And also an academic analysis of the case noted that the contract given to the participants allowed for the relinquishment of certain rights, but it didn't absolve the production of the duty of care. And so in October of 2012, the lawsuit was settled out of court, but the exact terms of course remained undisclosed. But while for Tanya this case was closed, the impact it had went far beyond a private settlement. The reaction by the media was actually immediate, and the entertainment industry also took note, and so they introduced new alcohol policies on sets, and psychological screenings also became more common. This next case, however, turned a secret crush reveal into something fatal.
Man, my sister has to get this out of man.
It's the 1990s, and daytime talk shows are built on spectacles, secrets, and confessions, and especially confrontations filled television screens across America. And it was around this period that the Jenny Jones Show would go from light daytime talk show about cooking, fashion, and celebrity gossip to talking about more sensational topics, such as secret crushes and emotional betrayals, something that kept audiences glued to their screens. But one episode of the Jenny Jones Show would turn that formula into tragedy. In March of 1995, an episode of the show was released titled Same Secret Crushes. The premise was easy to understand. Unsuspecting guests would be brought on stage to hear that someone they knew, a friend, a neighbor, or even a co-worker, secretly had romantic feelings for them. And among the guests was 32-year-old Scott Amador from Michigan. Friends described him as outgoing and kind-hearted, someone who didn't mind being the center of attention. Scott also had a playful sense of humor and was open about his sexuality. And through mutual friends, he'd met Jonathan Schmitz, a 24-year-old acquaintance who was polite, soft-spoken, and by all accounts, straight. But despite that fact, Scott developed a harmless crush on Jonathan and confided this to a mutual friend, Donna Riley. And when producers from the Jenny Jones Show learned about that, they decided to call Scott with an offer. He could reveal his secret crush on national television, and the producers promised that it would be a lighthearted surprise. And so Scott agreed. But when the show actually contacted Jonathan, they carefully avoided telling him the full truth. Instead, they just told him someone he knew had a crush on him. So naturally, Jonathan assumed it was a woman, and so he agreed to appear, unaware of the setup waiting for him. And so on March 6, 1995, the taping began in Chicago. The studio was bright and loud and filled with an audience ready to react. Scott sat on stage next to Donna, laughing nervously, and when Jenny asked him to describe his crush, Scott grinned and called him a
Tiny little cute thing.
drawing laughter from the crowd.
Oh, he's just a tiny little cute thing. He's gorgeous.
Moments later, Jonathan was then brought on stage. At first he smiled, expecting a flirtatious surprise, but then he suddenly saw a scar, and the confusion on his face was immediate, followed by embarrassment. The audience laughed louder, while Jenny teased him, asking if he was surprised, but Jonathan tried to stay composed and replied that he was actually heterosexual.
Well, you know, it's flattering, but I am definitely heterosexual.
The segment moved on, but Jonathan's discomfort was still visible, and after the taping, all three, Scott, Jonathan, and Donna, returned to Michigan. Back there, Jonathan then told friends and acquaintances that he was quite embarrassed and humiliated by the experience, and had developed a drinking problem because of that. Now, the episode was scheduled to air later that month, but just 3 days later, on March 9th, 1995, the story took a deadly turn. That morning, Jonathan found a suggestive note on his front door from Scott, and so he decided to drive to his local bank, withdraw money from his savings, and purchase a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, plus some ammunition. After that, he drove to Scott's home, and when Scott opened the door, Jonathan confronted him about the note he'd left earlier. But instead of responding defensively, Scott simply smiled, unaware of the anger beneath Jonathan's calm tone. Jonathan said he needed to step outside to turn off his car, but that wasn't the real reason. In reality, he walked back to his vehicle, retrieved the 12-gauge shotgun he'd purchased, and returned to the trailer. And moments later, he raised the gun and fired twice. Scott Amador was struck in the chest and died almost immediately. Jonathan then immediately drove away from the scene, but later called 911 to report himself, telling the operator, the murder sent shockwaves across the country. The actual episode hadn't been aired yet, but news of the killing spread quickly, and footage from the taping was soon released as evidence, giving the public a glimpse of humiliation that preceded the tragedy. In 1996, the case then went to trial, and defense attorneys argued that Jonathan Schmitz had been provoked, manipulated by producers who knew his mental state was fragile, especially since he'd been diagnosed with manic depression and was taking prescribed medication. They claimed that the surprise reveal, combined with nationwide embarrassment, pushed him into a psychological breakdown, but the prosecutors countered that the killing wasn't an impulsive act, but a calculated one. Jonathan had taken out cash, purchased a shotgun, and driven directly to confront Scott, and so these deliberate choices demonstrated premeditation. At the end of the trial, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, and so Jonathan Schmitz was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. Now, Scott Amador's family, overwhelmed by grief, later filed a civil lawsuit against the Jenny Jones show, its producers, and parent company Warner Bros. They accused the network of negligence, arguing that the Amber-style setup created a foreseeable risk of emotional harm and tragedy. And in 1999, a Michigan jury agreed and awarded $25 million in damages to the Amador family, but that decision was later actually overturned on appeal, as the court ruled that the show couldn't have foreseen Jonathan's violent reaction, and that holding producers legally responsible for a guest criminal act would set a dangerous precedent for the media. But despite that, in the years that followed, talk shows quietly changed their practices. Psychological screenings became more common, and surprise segments were limited or heavily supervised. For Jonathan himself, he served 22 years in prison before being released on parole in 2017, and has lived a private life ever since, and he hasn't spoken publicly about the case. As for the Jenny Jones show, it continued airing for several more years, but never actually escaped the shadow of Scott Amador's death. Jenny herself expressed sympathy but denied responsibility, saying that the tragedy was fundamentally wrong and it was unfair to blame the show itself. This next story, however, is about a tragic romance gone horribly wrong.
What he has done to Jasmine is unspeakable.
It begins with a 28-year-old model named Jasmine Fior, known for her work in promotional events and fitness competitions. Jasmine traveled constantly and kept a tight circle of friends, and for those who knew her, described her as someone approachable and sincere, in a way that stood out in an industry built on appearances rather than authenticity. Ryan Jenkins was a contestant on Megan Once a Millionaire, an American reality TV series on VH1, where a Megan Hauserman had 17 wealthy single men to compete for her. Charming and confident, Ryan sought fame and was determined to stand out among the other contestants, and he actually also made it all the way to finals. After the show wrapped up, Ryan's path crossed with Jasmine in Las Vegas. Their connection was instant, and just 2 days later, on March 18, 2009, they married at the Little White Wedding Chapel on the Las Vegas Strip. However, beyond the public eye, the charm quickly faded. While filming another reality show, I Love Money 3, Ryan's jealousy and suspicion had already begun to take hold. Mark Cronin, one of the show's producers, later recalled how those feelings quickly shifted from amusing to alarming.
He was very jealous and very suspicious of her.
He then added,
It was funny until it wasn't funny at all.
Ryan's insecurity also became impossible to ignore. He constantly demanded updates on Jasmine's whereabouts and explanations for everyday actions. According to Mark,
He would ask her, where were you last night? Because he's in Mexico shooting the show and she lives in Las Vegas.
it was a question that sounded casual on the surface, but the repetition revealed something darker building underneath. There were witnesses who saw bruises, and there were nights when Jasmine confided to people she trusted that the relationship had started to feel suffocated, that Ryan's behavior edged past concern and straight into control. One friend also recalled her admitting that it just didn't work anymore, and these signs weren't just whispers between friends. On one occasion, her former fiancé told people that he watched Ryan punch her hard enough to knock her into a pool, an incident serious enough that Ryan was charged with a misdemeanor domestic violence count, with a court date already scheduled for December that year. On the night of August 13th, the couple checked into the L'Auberge Del Mar resort in San Diego, and they were seen arguing in the lobby again, loud enough to draw attention, but not loud enough for anyone to intervene. And hours later, they left a poker event together. That was the last time Jasmine was seen alive. The next morning on Saturday, August 15th at 7:10 a.m., the police were dispatched to an apartment complex after a maintenance worker reported something unusual near the dumpsters. But nothing about the call suggested a horrors waiting for officers. When the police arrived on the scene, they approached a large gray suitcase, stained heavy and slightly torn at the seams. And as soon as they unzipped it, the smell of blood filled the air. Inside was a woman, folded unnaturally, as if someone had tried to force her in with no regard for dignity or life. She had been beaten so severely that her face was unrecognizable, and every one of her fingers had been cut off, and every tooth had been pulled or broken out. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to unalive her, they were trying to erase her. No fingerprints and no dental records. No easy path to identification. But what the killer didn't consider was that forensic science goes farther than just fingerprints and dental charts. Investigators had one remaining option. One Ryan couldn't cut out or destroy. A medical examiner explained it plainly.
If you have something surgically implanted in you by a surgeon, that is going to have a serial number, and that serial number will be recorded.
And Jasmine did happen to have these implants. And so those numbers gave detectives exactly what they needed. They traced it back to its manufacturer, then to the clinic, and then finally to the patient. The victim, of course, was Jasmine Fior. As news broke out, investigators immediately looked at Ryan, not because of the television show, but because he'd vanished too. He had checked out of the hotel early and drove across state lines, disappearing before police could question him. And by the time a warrant was issued, he was already out of reach. Only his family had brief contact with him, and they said they were worried about it, describing Ryan as somewhat normal, but deeply distraught over his wife's death, so Jasmine. His sister also recalled a conversation where he expressed how much he loved his wife, and how very, very upset he was. And he actually said that he would be clearing his name. And the sister also insisted that Ryan couldn't possibly do this, and further pushed that he was innocent. But in reality, Ryan had already crossed into Canada on his own and was hiding in Thunderbird Motel on the outskirts of Hope in Vancouver, trying to stay ahead of the investigation closing in on it. But 3 days later, a housekeeper unlocked the room and found Ryan not alive anymore by his own cause. Now inside the room, investigators found a 1.5-page note on his laptop, which police later described as a strange mix of devotion and accusation. He wrote that he truly loved Jasmine, yet in the same breath he shifted the blame onto her, insisting that their marriage had been the source of his pain and framing himself as the victim. Sergeant Bill Kohanek, one of the officers involved in the case, explained it plainly.
Placing blame on her in the relationship, quite a few accusations. It was kind of a love/hate letter.
Ryan also apologized to his family for the chaos. He also apologized for the embarrassment, but not once did he apologize to Jasmine. For the investigators, the story ended abruptly. For Jasmine's family, however, it never stopped. They lost a daughter to a man who was allowed to charm his way onto national television, despite a history of violence. And what followed changed the industry. VH1 cancelled the show, and networks scrambled to rethink the way they screen contestants. But the damage was already done. And while one victim's story shocked millions worldwide, this next story shows a man whose darkness was hidden in plain sight, right on national television.
İki karısını öldüren 62 yaşındaki şahıs evlilik programına katılarak yeniden evlenmek istediğini söyledi.
It was the year 2014, and Luck of Draw was preparing another routine episode. It was a Turkish dating program where strangers spent life on stage, hoping to find love in front of millions of viewers. But for one contestant, the cameras would capture far more than just their search for romance. His name was Sefer Kanala, and before he stepped onto Turkey's popular dating show, he'd already left a trail of violence that stretched back decades. And while the producers believed they were just bringing in another contestant with a complicated past, what they didn't know was that they were about to broadcast a haunting confession. As soon as the interview began, Sefer was asked about his past, as well as his reason for seeking love and a fresh start. And with settling unease, he began recounting his story, starting with his first marriage. He talked about his first wife, Fadim, a woman he claimed nagged too much. But before he revealed how the marriage ended, the host pressed him to explain how it began. He smiled faintly and leaned back.
First, I married my uncle's daughter,
he said. What he meant by uncle's daughter wasn't a direct cousin, but a distant relative. His grandfather's rather. Still, she was a relative. Sefer then claimed he was only
a young boy,
as he put it, and the marriage hadn't been arranged, no family consent and no plan, but simply an impulse.
I didn't even love her,
he confessed.
I just took her, ran away with her.
The host froze for a moment, visibly taken aback, as Sefer kinda admitted he'd kidnapped someone, a person he admitted he didn't even love. When the host asked why, Sefer shrugged, claiming someone else was supposed to marry his first wife, but he didn't want that, so he took her away and ruined her life. For a few months, they lived under the same roof as his family. There was no official ceremony, and he wasn't even of legal age, but in his mind, it was done.
We were fine in about 5 months,
he recalled.
Then she started doing things I couldn't accept. I got angry.
And then the tone shifted. He lowered his voice.
Sonucu kader kurbanı olarak cezaevine düştüm, cezasını yaptım.
The host pushed further, asking,
did you get rid of your wife?
Instead of admitting what he'd done, Sefer insisted it was fate. He described it as jealousy, claiming that her behavior provoked him and that he acted out when he shouldn't have. He framed it as a moment of lost control, a sudden burst of anger, which he regretted, or so he said. To Sefer, fate was a shield and not an admission, even though he literally just said that he murdered his wife, but he simply framed it as something that just happened to him, rather than something he chose. But the studio fell silent long before he finished speaking. Sefer explained that he was sentenced to prison for nearly 14 years for a death, but released early due to amnesty laws. The host tried to keep the conversation moving, but his calmness turned every word into something darker. Saffer then moved on to another relationship he'd had with another woman he met after he got out of prison. She was already married when they began seeing each other, but promised to leave her husband for him. And when she went back on her word and their fights escalated, and in what he described as self-defense, he said he accidentally took her life when she swung an axe. After his incident with his second wife, he served another 6 years in prison before being released once again, benefiting from a national amnesty. And when confronted, Saffer acknowledged,
Olmasa iyiydi ama oldu ne?
despite his attempts to downplay the circumstances as accidental, the pattern of violence was undeniable. And by then, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted fully. Audience members were no longer smiling, and the hosts exchanged looks with the producers, an unspoken understanding that something was very wrong. But despite that, Saffer continued talking, still wearing that unsettling calm. Past had already caught up to him. The moment he confessed to 2 separate killings on live television, the dating show was no longer a dating show. It turned into something like a crime scene, and so the host made the decision to remove him immediately before the taping continued.
Ne olur yani lütfen beni yanlış anlamayın ama ben programı terk etmenizi istiyorum.
But after hearing a killer speak so casually of his past, the next case reveals how private torment and public fame collided with devastating consequences.
How did we know that Chris Benoit would turn into a monster?
It's June 25th, 2007. Inside a quiet upper-middle-class neighborhood in Fayetteville, Georgia, police officers enter a 2-story brick home belonging to one of WWE's most respected athletes, Chris Benoit. And what they find inside will send shockwaves to the world of professional wrestling and destroy the legacy of a man known as a favorite among WWE fans for his unbelievable wrestling ability. The story, however, doesn't start here. It begins 40 years earlier in Montreal, Quebec, where Chris Benoit was born on May 22nd, 1967. Raised in Edmonton, Alberta, he grew up idolizing wrestling legends like the Dynamite Kid and bred the Hitman Hart, and so at 18 he joined Stampede Wrestling, a Canadian professional wrestling promotion based in Calgary, Alberta, under promoter Stu Hart, making his debut on November 22nd, 1985. By 1988, Chris briefly joined Extreme Champion Wrestling, or ECW, in the US, where a match gone wrong fractured another wrestler's neck, leading fans to dub him the Crippler. This nickname would stick, both as a brand and later a haunting symbol, and after years of slow recognition, finally becoming the WCW World Heavyweight Champion in January of 2000, he gained his first major world title. During this journey, Chris also met Nancy Toffoloni, known to fan as Woman, who was managing wrestlers as part of an ongoing storyline. Their on-screen partnership soon became real, leading to Nancy's separation from her then husband, Kevin Sullivan, another professional wrestler at the time. And so on November 23rd, 2000, Chris and Nancy were married. To the public, it looked like a perfect union born out of the business they both loved. Beneath the facade, however, their life together was complicated, marked by demanding travel schedules and mounting injuries, not to mention the pressures of actual fame. But the couple, despite that, had a son, Daniel, who was unfortunately born with Fragile X syndrome, a rare genetic developmental disorder often associated with learning disabilities and traits of autism. According to WWE attorney Jerry McDevitt, the condition had become a source of tension in the household, with Chris and Nancy reportedly arguing over whether he should stay home more to care for their son. That same year, Chris signed with the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, that later rebranded as WWE, and over the next 7 years, he would establish himself as one of the most technically gifted and disciplined performers in the industry. Chris won the Royal Rumble, where he defeated Triple H and Shawn Michaels to become World Heavyweight Champion. It was supposed to be the peak of his career. The crowd chanted his name, and Eddie Guerrero, his best friend, joined him in tears inside the ring. For Chris, it was the ultimate validation after 2 decades of sacrifice. But underneath the stoic expression and disciplined persona, something darker was forming. He had years of concussions, chronic pain, and actually a dependence on painkillers and steroids just to get through each match. And this substance abuse was actually widespread in professional wrestling. It was a dangerous norm that eventually sparked public scandal and federal scrutiny across the industry. And then in November of 2005, his closest friend, Eddie Guerrero, suddenly died of heart failure caused by years of substance abuse. And those close to Chris said he was never the same again.
When Eddie died, he was a totally changed person.
He became withdrawn and paranoid, fixated on guilt and control, but most importantly, religion. And if we fast forward to Friday, June 22nd, 2007, Chris was scheduled to perform at a WWE event in Texas, Vengeance Night of Champions, a professional wrestling pay-per-view episode, but instead he called management, claiming he had personal issues to attend to, though it was never specified what they were. And although it was announced that Chris wouldn't appear, fans in attendance still chanted his name throughout the show, demanding his presence.
SmackDown Raw, you need to get out. You want to be the top dog. And who's going to be the...
But behind it all, something far more sinister was already unfolding. The very same night, Chris brutally attacked his wife, Nancy, bounding her with a rope and beating her up before strangling her, ending her life. And then a Bible was placed behind her. The next morning, June 23rd, Chris also took the lives of their son, Daniel, and the autopsy later revealed high levels of Xanax in their son, a medication that treats anxiety, but was actually used to sedate him before his death. Another Bible was placed beside him. After taking the lives of Nancy and Daniel across the weekend, Chris sat down at his computer and searched for passages about the prophet Elijah from the Bible, specifically a story where Elijah resurrects a young man in the Old Testament. And not long after, after, he searched for the quickest and most painless way to break a neck. That detail would later become hauntingly significant. On June 24th, Chris brought a half-empty bottle of wine with him into his home gym. There, he adjusted the weights of his sled pull-down machine to 240 pounds and left this earth on his own too. A Bible was found near Chris, just like the ones left beside Nancy and Daniel. Inside was a handwritten note that read,
"I am preparing to leave this earth."
Whatever unfolded inside this house, it was clear that Chris had been planning it for a long time before anyone actually realized. And when he failed to appear at the WWE's pay-per-view event that evening, friends and fellow wrestlers grew suspicious.
My name is Dennis Fagan. I run the security for World Wrestling, and one of our wrestlers that lives down there is missing.
And what's his name?
Chris Benoit. It's out of character for him.
And so the police were actually dispatched for a welfare check. And according to reports, WWE stated on its website that the company had contacted authorities after receiving several curious text messages from Chris early Sunday morning. The original post has since been removed, but multiple news outlets at the time documented its contents. It was never revealed, however, what Chris' text messages actually said, only that they raised enough concern for WWE to contact authorities. And upon entering the house, the officers found 3 bodies: Chris, Nancy, and their son Daniel. Initially, WWE believed it was a tragic accident, and so that night they aired a 3-hour tribute show replaying Chris's greatest moments, filled with tears and emotional testimonials. But within hours, investigators confirmed that it was a double fatal incident and one self-inflicted act. That man, the man who had millions of fans and was admired as a hero, wiped out his own family. Inside the house, police found dozens of prescription bottles, steroids, painkillers, anti-anxiety medication, all drugs he had for himself. And tests later also showed that Chris' testosterone levels were 10 times higher than normal. Now, the media immediately blamed roid rage, but neurologists actually disagreed. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was a calculated act spread over days. And when scientists later examined Chris's brain, the findings were catastrophic. He was suffering from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. His brain, according to doctors, looked like that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Years of concussions and unprotected chair shots had destroyed his impulse control and emotional stability, and so WWE distanced itself immediately. Within 24 hours, every mention of Chris, every match, every photo and video was erased from his website and broadcast. His name was scrubbed from record books and storylines, and even tribute reels. In the aftermath, the wrestling world was forced to face questions it had ignored for years about concussions and steroid abuse. And so new concussion protocols were introduced, chair shots to the head were banned, and drug testing became mandatory. But the damage was already done. To this day, this story remains one of the most disturbing crimes in sports and entertainment history. But just as this story is now closed, this next story about Robert Durst's life is about to take an even darker and more disturbing turn.
He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for murdering a friend who'd been asking too many questions about the mysterious disappearance of Durst's former wife.
In March of 2015, police arrested an elderly man in a small New Orleans hotel. He was quiet and polite, but was traveling under the false name Everett Ward. And inside his room, investigators found disguises, fake identities, $40,000 in cash, and a revolver. To most, he looked like another fugitive running from something, but to the authorities, he was the end of a mystery that haunted America for more than 30 years. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943. He was the eldest son of Seymour and Bernice Durst, heirs to one of New York's largest real estate empires, the Durst Organization. So it's safe to say he grew up in a world of privilege, surrounded by money and power. As he grew older, Robert originally planned to follow in his father's footsteps, studying economics and business to prepare to inherit the family's fortune. But his relationship with his father became strained, and so Robert then tried working in the family business to reassure his father he wasn't rejecting the legacy. But after spending a couple of years in the company, he quickly realized that the corporate world simply wasn't for him. His younger brother, Douglas, eventually replaced him as their heir to the family empire. In 1971, he then met Kathy McCormack, a 19-year-old dental hygienist from Long Island, New York. She was warm, ambitious, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. And it worked. They moved together in January of 1972 and got married on April 12, 1973, a little over a year after they first met. And soon after, he quit the family estate business completely, and the couple moved to Vermont to open All Good Things, a small health food store. In private, Kathy's life with Robert was far from picture perfect. In her diary, she began writing about Robert's mistreatment, with entries describing arguments and her growing sense that something was very wrong. But it wasn't just Kathy who saw the cracks. Her family witnessed the abuse firsthand. Kathy's brother, Jim McCormack, recalled a family party where Robert wanted to leave early, but Kathy took her time.
He turned around and walked over and grabbed her by the hair and pretty much yanked her off the couch,
Jim said. And by 1982, after years of control and violence, she actually decided to end the marriage and start over. Around the same time, she was then accepted into medical school and began planning her future without him. But then on January 31st, 1982, she vanished. The same evening, Kathy was last seen by someone other than Robert. She appeared unexpectedly at a dinner party hosted by her friend Gilberte Najami in Newtown, Connecticut. Gilberte noticed Kathy seemed upset and wore red sweatpants, unusual for her public appearances. Kathy then received a phone call from her husband, after which she left the party early and headed to her cottage in South Salem, New York. Kathy and Gilberte were scheduled to meet the next day at a Manhattan pub, but when Kathy didn't show up and failed to respond to calls or messages, Gilberte's concern grew. Over the next several days, Gilbert repeatedly contacted the police, reporting Kathy's unusual disappearance. And later that day, Robert officially reported his wife missing, prompting police to launch an investigation. Officials began questioning those closest to her, including her husband. And during interviews, Robert told the police he dropped her off at Cantona train station that night, claiming she was headed back to their apartment in Manhattan. He also claimed he spoke to her later by phone, but investigators never found a single witness who saw Kathy arrive in the city. They believe Kathy might have left this earth on her own, but there was no body, no weapon, and no physical evidence. So the case went cold, and Robert walked away untouched. It was the first time he escaped suspicion, but it wouldn't be the last. Nearly 20 years after Kathleen Durst disappeared, Robert had already left New York, moving across the country where he could live quietly under the radar. And while he completely cut ties with most of his family, there was one person who stayed close to him, someone he knew more than anyone else. Her name was Susan Berman. Susan was a writer and journalist, known in Hollywood for his sharp wit and mobster family background. Her father, Davy Berman, had once been a Las Vegas crime figure. She and Robert met in college in UCLA and bonded instantly. And when Kathy vanished in 1982, Susan defended Robert without hesitation. She spoke to reporters on Robert's behalf, becoming his unofficial spokesperson, and Susan often managed how the public perceived her, helping to steer attention away from Kathy's disappearance. And in doing so, she helped keep suspicion off Robert for years. On December 24th, 2000, a neighbor noticed Susan's dog running loose outside her home. Concerned, they contacted police to report an open door and no response from inside. And when police officers arrived, they simply entered through the unlocked entrance and found Susan's body on the floor. She'd been shot once in the back of the head. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant that whoever ended her life, she had let them in. Days later, a letter arrived at the Beverly Hills Police Department. It contained Susan's address, a single word, and a misspelled name. It read,
Cadaver.
Police had one dead wife, one dead friend, and one suspect. But before they could arrest him, Robert Durst simply vanished. For months, no one knew where he was, until police traced him to a coastal town nearly 1,600 miles away. He was now living in Texas, under the name Dorothy Siner, disguised as a mute woman. He wore a wig and large glasses to avoid recognition. Dorothy kept to herself, communicated through handwritten notes, and paid rent in cash, carefully avoiding any attention. Next door lived a 71-year-old retiree named Morris Black, short-tempered and quite outspoken. Robert would later claim that the two had become close friends, even calling Morris his best buddy, but no one in the building ever saw them actually together. On September 28, 2001, Robert returned to his apartment and found Morris inside without permission. Morris had a spare key to the unit and was sitting on the couch, watching television, and moments later, the situation spiraled. Robert saw Morris became agitated over an eviction letter addressed to him and suddenly fired a gun at him. He then lunged for the barrel, and the two men struggled. During the fight, the gun went off, ending Morris's life instantly in what he describes as self-defense. Panicked and unsure of what to do next, he decided to get rid of the evidence. So he placed Morris's body in a garbage bag and dumped it into a nearby bay, hoping the water would wash the whole thing away. But 2 days later, a group of young people discovered a torso floating in Galveston Bay. Nearby, several trash bags were also drifting in the water. Inside those bags were human remains, arms, legs, but no head. And police were quickly alerted and began an investigation to identify the victim. The body wasn't identified through physical means at first. Instead, investigators found a piece of newspaper inside one of the trash bags with a delivery sticker showing a Galveston address. Police then traced the label to a small apartment building where the victim, Morris, was one of the only 4 people living there. And because the apartment next to the victim was rented under the name of Dorothy Siner, the police did immediately connect the case to Robert. It was only after searching the communal trash behind the building that police found a receipt with the name Robert Durst. This discovery led them to realize that Dorothy was an alias used by him, further linking him to the crime. And the gun used to shoot Morris was also a pistol registered under Robert's name. And so police searched Robert's apartment, and they found blood spattered all over the kitchen, as well as other tools used to dismember a body, while the lease name was under the name Dorothy Siner. But even though the name wasn't familiar, the handwriting was unmistakable. This was Robert Durst hiding in plain sight. He was arrested a week later while stealing a sandwich at a grocery store in Pennsylvania, and in his car, investigators found $37,000 in cash, 2 loaded guns, marijuana, and Morris Black's driver's license. And despite admitting to getting rid of and dismembering Morris Black, the jury accepted his claim of self-defense, since without the victim's head, prosecutors couldn't prove otherwise. Against all the odds, Robert Durst walked free, and by the early 2010s, Robert faded into near obscurity. He was a free man, older and mostly forgotten, but in 2015, that changed. A documentary crew from HBO began investigating the 3 deaths that followed him for decades. It was called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. To the filmmakers, it was a rare chance to hear Robert's story in his own words, and to Robert, it was something else, an opportunity to control the narrative one last time. Throughout the interviews, he was calm, and it seemed like he had everything in check. But as the cameras kept rolling, cracks began to show. Evidence that had remained buried for decades later revealed that Robert's story about Kathy's disappearance was never consistent. He once claimed to have spoken to her after dropping her off at the train station. One call supposedly made from their Salem house, another from a restaurant payphone, and one more from a public phone outside while walking his dog. Yet phone records and witness statements contradicted all of those claims, and files discovered from the Durst organization showed that the family had quietly hired a private investigator after Kathy vanished and had noted the same time inconsistencies. At first, the doorman said he saw Kathy enter the building that night, but upon re-interview, he admitted he wasn't sure she ever did. Then came the biggest discovery. When investigators revisited the anonymous cadaver letter that had arrived shortly after Susan's passing, they decided to compare it to a letter Robert had written years before, and when the director placed the two side by side, the handwriting was identical. For the first time, Robert Durst had no answers. He blinked, shifted in his chair, and stared at the letter in silence, and when asked which one he had written, he couldn't tell. Moments later, the interview was over. He excused himself and walked into the bathroom, still however wearing his stiff microphone, and began mumbling to himself, thinking that nobody could hear him.
There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
The words that Robert Durst had spent a lifetime avoiding were finally spoken. Not to police, not to a judge, but to himself in a bathroom. This episode aired in March of 2015, and within 24 hours after broadcast, the FBI arrested him in New Orleans, inside his hotel room, and they found disguises, $40,000 in cash, and a revolver. He'd been planning to flee once again. After years of speculation, the evidence had finally caught up, and in 2021, a California jury convicted him of taking the life of Susan Berman. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Robert never stood trial for the disappearance of his wife, however, Kathy. He eventually died in January of 2022 in a hospital cell at the age of 78.